Hi, I'm Darryl Belosky. From time to time, I get a lot of questions from people. What are Oracle indices? Why do I need them? What good are they? What type of format are they? And that's what I'm going to be here today to try to explain to you. What is the Oracle indexing strategy? How do they actually work? What do they actually do for you? Now, in Oracle, our indices are called a B tree. So we store everything in a tree format. No surprises there. But the interesting thing is what does the B stand for? And a lot of people think that means binary tree. And Oracle indices aren't a binary tree. Now, a binary tree is two values, yes, no. And they get very, very deep, but very, very narrow. Oracle indices are the opposite of that. They actually do not go very deep, and we strive for them not to be deep. But what we do is we spread the data out in a tree format, very, very wide. Now, what is stored in this indices? Well, we use that tree format to find out key values and locations of that data. Now, the key value can be something very, very simple, like your primary key, employee, let's say employee ID. That's our primary key of our employees table. Everybody has one and only one primary key, one and only one employee ID. We're going to use that. Now, let's pretend we're a small company. We have about 100 people in it. So we're going to show you and build a little index around that. So our index basically has your employee ID. But how do they use that to point to the record? Do they just say the record? No, we have to tell the database where the record is located. And we do that with a row ID. Now, what is a row ID? It's a number. It's derived into 4 components. The first component is our object ID, and that tells us what object it belongs to. Our second component is a file number. And it tells us what data file this block this row ID belongs to. So our system table space is file 1, file 2, file 3. So it tells us what data file it is. The third part of it is a block number. So file 5, block 600. File 6, block 700, or so on and so on. The last is location in block. Now think about a block. What does a block have? It can contain a piece of information, or one row, part of a row, or lots of rows. So which row are we talking about in the block? And that's the last component of this. So a row ID is just an object ID, a file, a block, and a location in block. It's a physical address in our data file where we can find the record. So if we have a key value in a row ID, we should be able to go directly and read the block and get the right row that we need. This prevents us from doing what? Full table scans all the time. If all we could do was look everything up by doing a full table scan, well, it wouldn't scale very well. Let's just say that with our data. We need the ability to quickly be able to retrieve the row that we want, or the rows that we want, no more, no less. And that's what indices allow us to do. Now the question is do we just throw them all in a big table? Not really. We actually have that tree structure. And I'm going to kind of go over a little bit of the tree structure. Now if you give me a moment, I'm going to draw it up here on the board. I'm going to draw a basic little structure. Okay, and this is our typical tree format that we have. Everything above the bottom level is called a branch. Everything stems off of what I call a root node for our indice. In this case, our root node is here. Now, what's going to be covering in that? It's going to tell us where we can find our data and which branch of the tree do we need to traverse to find our data. And again, let's say we're a small company. We have employees 1 through 100. There's some gaps in that sequence as well, so there's people come and go. So let's just say that this is branch A and this is branch B. So our root node tells us that if we're looking for employees 1 through, let's say 45, go to branch A. If we're looking for 51 through 100, go to branch B. So now our root node tells us what? Where everything is and where everything points to. So we're going to go down a level. So we're now at level 1. This branch here says we've got some more blocks underneath. These blocks are called leaf blocks. And I'm going to label these E, F, G, and H. So what have we done? We've gone from one branch to the next. Now let's say we're looking for employee ID 25. So we come to our root node. It says go to branch A. So let's find branch A. Here's branch A. Now branch A will tell us if you're looking for 1 through 22, go to block E. If you're looking for 24 through 45, go to block F. We're looking for employee ID what? We're looking for 25. So we're going to go to block E. Now then, this is the next level down. Okay. So what is this going to have? This is going to have the data. This level here is the bottom of the tree. These are no longer branches. These are called leaf blocks. What do the leaf blocks store? Simply the key and the row ID. So we would have employee 1 and row ID, 2 and its row ID, all the way down to 22. Now, if we were looking for employee 25, where would we be going? Well, we'd look at this branch and we'd be going to this leaf block. And there we would see 24 plus a row ID, the key value of 25, row ID, all the way down to the value of 45 in its row ID. Mind you, each row ID is separate and distinct, pointing us to that key value. So this is how we would look up on an index. And think about the number of IOs that would come on to play here. So we first have to, when we're searching for employee 25, we hit this root node. It tells us go to this branch, so that's 1 IO, 2 IO. On this IO, it says, hey, go to this leaf node, 3 IOs. So when I look up in a structure like this, I would have 3 IOs. Now, how many levels do we have and how many branches we have is dependent upon how much data is out there. We can actually have the root node actually be a leaf node if we have very small amount of data. But if our key values are larger, we're going to start breaking down branches in bigger levels like this. So that's the structure at which we have it. Now, when somebody wants to do an insert of data, say we hire employee 23. Okay, we don't have a 23 listed here. So what do we do when we want to insert a new record? Well, we'll take a look, we'll follow to the branch, and then we'll make a choice. If this is not filled, we'll add it here, and that's probably the most likely. But what if this is filled and this is filled? Well, we'll have to add a new leaf block out here and maybe force a split somewhere so that we would have the data. So then what would happen? Well, then if we had to split off things, then we would get a fragmented So we would get leaf blocks that are not tightly packed. Now, one thing that I left off on this so far, how do we get to this leaf block, to this leaf block, to this leaf block, to this leaf block? They're all linked. We actually have a link that points us to the next one in the chain. Notice something about how the data is stored in the leaf blocks. They're stored in relatively sorted order. So if we're looking for something in, like, say, primary key order, we would get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, block to block to block. So this will tell us how we can go out and read our data in very nicely. So sometimes you can get transverses that you can follow your index tree down to your first block and then just start scanning block to block without having to transverse the tree again. That's how the balanced tree works. It actually gives us an opportunity to look at data back and forth. Now again, if we have a situation that we needed to add data, let's add a bigger number here so I can show you what a split is. Let's say we didn't have employee ID 12. We're recycling the number. Employee 12 left. We're going to get another employee, but this block has been filled up. What's going to happen? Well, we're going to add a new block here. We're going to change the pointers. We're going to split off data in here. So now we're going to get 12. Well, actually, let's make that a little bit bigger so we could read it. So we're going to get 12, 13, all the way up to 24. So what happens to this space here? Well, that space is dead for now. We can't use it. We can't reclaim it. Normally, in normal blocks, what happens is you don't reclaim the space until it's completely empty. We give you some tools to help you clean up scenarios like this. Now, a lot of people would say, oh, I have to rebuild the indices. And the answer is no. When you get conditions like this and you get sparsely populated blocks on this level, what can you do about it? Well, we can coalesce the index. What does that do? That's kind of like a repacking just on the leaf level alone. We start and we look for situations, start at the beginning, and we say, oh, we can pull some entries back and let's kind of shift everybody over down the whole indice. Does nothing to affect the height of the indice, but it just kind of like a shift left all the way through. Pack everybody over. So at the end here, we're going to leave a couple of empty blocks. Now, one of the things I did miss telling you about is we had some changes in pointers here. So since we only held up to 11, now we have 12. We'll call this block I. Block 23 and I. So now when we transverse this tree, if we're looking for entry 13, we're going to go to block I, which is right here, and we're going to look up our row ID. So that's how our indices work here in Oracle. This is what we use. Now, a couple of questions that I commonly get is, well, my indice, it's very tall. Should I be worried? Well, there are some generalizations out there and general rules, but think about the height is what is going to determine how many IOs it's going to take to get you to the read, to the leaf block. So 1 IO, 2 IO, 3 IO. If I have a full leaf block here, or sorry, a full branch block here, what's going to happen? Well, we're going to start breaking out the branch blocks. What if this level gets completely filled up? I can't put any more here. Well, then we're going to go another level deeper. And what's that going to mean? It's going to mean additional IOs down to the final level, the leaf blocks that have our data. So should I be worried? Yes and no. Yes and no. Remember, the world has changed greatly. When I started working with databases, we thought very big databases were 1 gig. You know, now if somebody said, yeah, I only had a gig database, probably look at me like there's something wrong. Common databases now are multi-terabytes. In fact, I was introduced to my first multi-petabyte database recently. Very large database. So you're going to start seeing more levels when you have large volumes of data. That's going to be a key factor that you're going to have to look at and make a decision about how your indices are laid out. Now, in a primary key index, of course, every row in the table, you're going to have a unique index entry for that. Definition of a primary key will point you to that direction anyways. So how many are you going to have? Well, it depends. Depends on how much data is. What really is affecting you is a couple of different things. Is the key value length. So what key are you looking for? Is it a number? Is it a string? Because that's going to affect how many leaf blocks there are and how much data we can fit in a leaf block. The row ID is pretty fixed. It's not going to be ridiculously in size, but the key value is the variable one that we can control. So think about how big your key value is that you're looking, and that will also affect your height, because the key value takes up data spots in the branch blocks as well as the leaf blocks. But when you really think about indices, just remember what I said. The leaves are where the money is at. The leaves are holding all the data. If you need to fix your indice, the first thing that I would recommend is always looking at a coalesce. Because remember what I said the coalesce is. Takes care of situations when we get sparsely populated blocks. Maybe the block is split apart. Or because you've inserted a row and it was filled. Or maybe you've had some deletes in the block. We've got people coming and going at our company all the time. So maybe we have entry slots that could be tightly packed. Why should I be worried about if they're not tightly packed or not? They're an indice. They're going to fall apart anyways, people always tell me. So why bother fixing them? You know, I have actually had that argument, and it's kind of like the same way I have an argument. I have a little daughter, and she looks at me and says, "Papa, why do I need to shower?" I said, "Because you're going to start to smell bad." And she says, "Well, it'll just happen to me again tomorrow, so why not just skip the shower and just deal with it?" And I'm like, "No, it doesn't work that way, honey." Same thing with our indices here. Yes, they are going to break. What's going to cause them to break? What's going to cause them to degrade in their performance? DML. Inserts, updates, deletes. So you're going to have to come back and either rebuild them, and a rebuild is completely from ground up. But a lot of times I find that's unnecessary. What we really need to do is just get the leaf blocks repacked and we coalesce them. So now when we read them into memory, we're going to get a nice tightly packed block. It's going to have the most entries. So what does that mean to us? It means we're conserving a finite resource, and that resource being memory. And by definition, the more entries in an index leaf block, the more interesting it is, and the more we'll tend to want to hang on to it in memory. If it's very sparsely populated, that means we're pushing out extra blocks of memory to make room for this indice that's not very efficient. So it's in your interest to coalesce these indices on a regular level. Just like I tell my little 8-year-old daughter, it's important that you shower every day so that you don't smell. It's very important that a DBA goes through on a periodic basis, and what the period is dependent upon the volatility of your data. That you're going to have to coalesce these to keep them as nicely and tightly packed as possible. Possibly even rebuilds on occasion, depending if the tree structure gets a little out of whack because you've done lots and lots of DML operations. You might want to consider that. Maybe you have more height to your indice than you actually really needed, and you'll have to rebuild that. Now that's a decision that you'll have to do based on going through and validating your index and analyzing your index, validating the structure, and looking at the results in a particular table called index underbar stats. And you'll have to make the decision if you need to rebuild your indices. Normally, I find, like I said, you really don't have to rebuild them all that often, but you should coalesce them when there is lots and lots of DML. Rebuilding is a last resort when we rebuild the whole tree. And occasionally we'll have to do that, again, when you get things like reorganizations of tables where you change the row IDs and such. That'll force you into that situation. So this is your basic components on the Oracle index. There are many different types of indices to look at. There are unique indices like primary keys. There are non-unique indices. There are compressed key indices. There are reverse indices. And there are bitmapped indices. We even have some things called like function-based indices, so they're looking at columns based on a function. It's worth taking a look through the concepts guide where they talk a little bit about each type of indice and how to use them. Well, this has been your introduction to balanced tree indices and what we do with Oracle to transpose the tree and transverse the tree and how we look up data and we insert data.